So let's start with, yes, we have universal health care in Canada. So our system is in many ways a lot like the Australian system. It's a lot like the systems in the UK and in Europe, and is very unlike the large country that sits below Canada. So let's put that system aside. So in Canada, we have a federal piece of legislation called the Canada Health Act, and that ensures that we do not pay for anything that's done to us in a hospital. We never pay for a doctor's visit. We don't pay to give birth to a child, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is automatically covered from our tax dollars that we are happy to pay. And it's one thing that as Canadians, if anybody tries to muddle with the idea of universal health care, they get shot down in a hurry. So we believe in universal health care. But that said, we also have a system similar to your states. We have provinces, and each province has jurisdiction over how healthcare is implemented in their province. So there really isn't one Canadian health system. There's many, at least a dozen, depending upon where you live. And when that comes to access to medications, we are trying our best to harmonize across the country. But as I'm sure is true in other countries, there are parts of the country that have more money than other parts. And so if you live in a part of the country in our East Coast, a small island, you might not have access to the same medication. And that's just a reality of our Canadian system. Canada has a very well established HTA system that is actually not a federal system, but it's called a pan-Canadian system. So all the provinces come together at a table and fund the HTA for all of Canada. So in theory, we would have some universality of recommendations and decisions. So that's where we're working together. So HTA is well grounded. We also have separately from our HTAs, we have our regulatory agency. So the way that we map a drug, I'm saying a drug, but it could be a technology, a drug, normally we pay attention when the FDA approves something. My personal opinion is that the bar at the FDA is getting lower and lower and lower. So the FDA often approves something with accelerated approval, it comes through very quickly, and then we start our clock and we start watching what happens. So usually it's submitted to our regulatory. That will come through usually in about 6 months from the US. And so that's good. That means the drug is safe and effective. And if you have private insurance on top of the universal coverage, you might be able to access it then once it's been regulatory approved. But for the vast majority of Canadians, they have to wait for HTA to go through its process, and then for the pricing negotiations, which in our system is actually a subsequent step, for the pricing negotiations to happen with the government. And so that entire timeline from FDA, if I count it from the US, to a patient having access in Canada, that can be 2 years. And so that's, you know, I work in cancer, I volunteer my time in cancer, and in advanced cancer, you can't wait 2 years if something is really effective. So as patient groups, we have to understand that whole system and kind of follow a drug through its many steps. It gets stuck sometimes, and sometimes it gets stuck because industry's not negotiating to the extent that the government wants them to. And so what we do is we don't get involved in that per se, but what we do is we make sure that a patient in need has access somehow, some way. And so as patient groups, we have sort of a list of, I'll say, tactics of what we will go through. But we push for compassionate access programs. We push for, you know, very quietly giving a patient access and not letting it get to the media. And then in worst case scenario, we'll go for the front page. That's not ideally how HTA works. I'm sorry, I said it.
But I understand the need there. And so in Australia, in our HTA Health Technology Assessment System, patients can really only start to get involved in the medicines assessments at that appraisal stage when it's coming into committee for that deliberation. I think in Canada they can get involved a bit earlier, can they? And how does that happen? And can you tell us a bit about your thoughts about earlier involvement in this area?
Yeah, I think my overall thought is that at HTA appraisal, it's too late. I mean, yes, you absolutely have to get involved because you need to state the position and to do your best for patients. But it really is too late in the game when you have, data from trials and it's not what you wanted. And sometimes they've used the wrong comparison drug and, all kinds of things that you wanted collected were not even asked. So it's a pretty crappy point in time to come in at the very end and to have been ignored for all of the steps prior to that. So I would say that in Canada right now, officially with our HTAs, we don't have a seat at early scientific advice when companies are first saying, I'm thinking about, approaching about this drug. So we don't get involved at that point. There is a two-step part of it's called CADIF is our agency. We have 2 steps where we can get involved, but I would really urge patient groups to think about how much of your resources do you want to spend at the end versus how much do you want to spend in trying to influence the data that you're going to end up with. So I've become involved much more in clinical trial design, and Canada's a huge country geographically, but we don't really matter that much to drug companies if we're honest. And for global pharmaceutical companies, the Canadian population at like 37 million is just like a blip. So what we've realized is if you want to influence the clinical trial, you have to get to the global pharmaceutical company. So work through your country organization, but try to get at those tables where you're discussing unmet patient needs, what we can do better in the next trial, how we need to better measure things like quality of life, because measuring it in these questionnaires doesn't make any sense. So there's a need to do that. There's a need to do that early stuff. But if you are finding yourself and it's late in the day and you have 30 days, that's our window in Canada, 30 days to put together an HTA submission, then you scramble. And what we do when we're scrambling is we go out to patients with patient surveys and we try to ask the questions that the trial didn't ask. So we put the submission in, and then after the submission has gone through, there's a deliberative meeting. We're not invited to that deliberation meeting. We're not on the phone. We have nothing to do with that. So we send it in and we get an acknowledgement that it has been received. And then there's a meeting that happens, and there is a public and or patient representative who then represents our submission, which again, I don't think is best practice. I think the best practices are really in England and in Scotland, where patient groups can be there in person to answer questions. But in our system, we're not involved. We get their draft recommendation and we have an opportunity to appeal at that point or send in a second submission if we think they have not followed due process. But it's not just to say, I disagree. You can't just disagree. You have to have a reason for disagreeing. So that is the process. And then it becomes a final recommendation once we've all had an opportunity to say, yes, you did something, or no, you didn't consider X, Y, and Z. So that's how our system works. It's a work in progress. It's not perfect. And personally, I look to Scotland and to England as having far better advancements, I think, in patient engagement in HTA.
That's interesting. So same here, as we can't see what goes on in these HTA meetings, but a slight different in process there in this ability to see a draft recommendation. So do you get feedback about the input or the submissions you make?
Yes, and that has actually been something positive in the last few years. We demanded some feedback because otherwise it was just like throwing something over a wall. And so now there's a feedback letter. Now, I'll be honest to say that it's not always helpful. So sometimes they will say, we acknowledge that you did an online survey, but it was only, a small sample. Well, we did our best. Sometimes we've had feedback that says, You didn't poll enough of the Indigenous population, of the rural population, of Canada's far north, and you read this in the feedback, and you think, how on earth could we? This is a volunteer effort, and sometimes they say an online survey is limited, that you really should be doing one-on-one interviews with patients, and so we are resource restrained. And they want, the stars, the moon, and everything. And we just can't get there. We need to be a fully fledged research agency to deliver everything that they want. And I've sometimes questioned, how much money or what they think we really do, because, in the organization that I started in Canada, Kidney Cancer Canada, we are there to help patients who've just had a life-threatening diagnosis. That is our raison d'etre, if I can throw in a bit of French. And so that's what we do. That's our mandate. This other HTA stuff of doing patient surveys and trying to find patients who are taking this drug, that's separate, but it's also really important. And so sometimes it's a little bit disheartening when they say, well, here are all the things that you didn't do. I was busy helping a patient stay alive that day.
Thanks, Deb. And as you know, we're scheduled to have an HTA review here in Australia over the next 12 months. And we're also, as part of that, I should say, we're having work is being done to co-design an enhanced consumer engagement system. And I wondered, what aspects of the Canadian system do you think are really good that we should look at and learn from?
Well, I know you use that word consumer, and we don't use that word consumer. So I think one of the aspects has been patient involvement in the deliberative committees. There's a very different tone when you have a patient representative versus a public representative. So there's a distinction there. And I think certainly in the cancer drugs review, we've made sure that there is a patient representative, because if you haven't had a diagnosis like this and you're thinking that all drugs are the same, you don't have the same urgency. So that is something I think that we can offer that has been really good. In other pieces of our system, the opportunity to appeal, or to come back on the draft recommendation, that's been really important to us. And that feedback letter that we get at the end, even if we don't always like it, the feedback letter is also important. I think where I'd like to see us go forward is to have more one-on-one trusted dialogue between the patient organization and the HTA people inside. What often happens, and forgive me because I know you have academic credentials, but what often happens is that they hire people who have PhDs in patient engagement, and they go off and have these discussions among themselves about, patient engagement and how it should be done, but it's all very academic and sort of obtuse. And I think what we bring is what it's like actually as a patient when you are trying to navigate your disease at the same time as that you're trying to navigate drug access and the financial implications of all of that. So, we bring a dose of reality to people who have studied patient engagement, but they haven't walked it the way that we've walked it. One of the parts I'm really proud of in our cancer drugs in Canada, that over 95% of the submissions, even for the rarest cancer drugs, they have a patient submission. Are they all of the same quality? Absolutely not. But every time some group puts something in. And so some of the umbrella organizations, I know in Australia you have Rare Cancers Australia, but for some of those bigger groups to pick up a submission when nobody else is going to be able to do it, I think it's vital. And they can't do this without us. They should not be allowed to do this without us. That's my plea.